am so excited to interview you, Kari Trent Stageberg, because I've seen you interviewed elsewhere and your story is so powerful. And then it's doubly powerful because you're from sort of a celebrity Christian family. Your father is John Trent, who wrote the amazing book, the best-selling book called The Blessing. You know, you are a loved child. Your parents, supported you. So why don't you start at the beginning and talk about your marriage and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, and every family has dysfunction. Our family is definitely not perfect and are still not perfect, but I did grow up in a great loving home. I mean, there wasn't a day where, my dad, wrote the book The Blessing in the 80s, and actually the year I was born, he wrote the book. And so there wasn't a day where I didn't receive a blessing from my parents. And that was so lived out in our home. But at the end of the day, it's our choice. Someone can say all that they want and impart all that they want into our lives, but we have to choose to receive that. And one of the bigger things for me was that the Lord just felt incredibly abstract. I saw faith lived out at home, but a lot of times in other locations, it just seemed like that's a bunch of rules without a bunch of benefit. And where is God really in my life? How does he actually interact with me on a personal level? And I really wrestled with that. And so for a long time, I walked away from the faith, and long story, very, very short, I ended up meeting a guy who I thought was the answer to all of my problems. We eloped, shocked my whole family, not the best thing to do when you have a dad in marriage and family ministry. And sorry, my dogs are starting to fight. Well, every family has dysfunction, and our family was not perfect. We're still not perfect. But I did grow up in a home where I knew I was loved. My dad wrote the book, The Blessing. It actually came out the year I was born. So I can honestly tell you that there was not a single day where I didn't know that someone was crazy about me. And I heard my whole life growing up that God was crazy about me. But the reality is we have a choice, and we can choose to either receive that or to not. And one of my big hangups in terms of receiving, both God's blessing and the truth that my parents were speaking was that I felt like the Lord was incredibly abstract. I could see faith lived out at home, but I really struggled to see how God mattered in my life. How did he actually relate to me? How is this not just a bunch of rules without a whole bunch of benefit? And I always believed Jesus was real, but I really struggled with, why would I follow someone that isn't invested in me? And, I saw a lot of hypocrisy, in the churches. I'm sure a lot of us did, growing up, and it just brought a lot of that to the surface. And so for a long time, I actually walked away from the faith, and long story, very, very short, I ended up eloping, shocking my whole family, which was quite a shock when you have a dad in marriage and family ministry. And then very shortly after that, I was already talking about filing for divorce. We had dated for several years before we ever got married. And, there were red flags left, right, and center. I struggled to see the red flags. Everyone else could see them clear as day. I just had no concept of what abuse was and how that was playing out in our relationship. I knew things weren't healthy, but I was convinced I could fix it. Well, no one would choose to live that way. So if I change my behavior, if we adapt this, if we go to counseling, if we do that, we're going to be fine and we can make anything work because we're both committed to this. And I just had no idea at all about abuse. And so we, after that elopement period, he actually deployed. So most of our actual marriage, he wasn't even in the same country. And about 8 months into that deployment, things were just a disaster. And that was the time when, I went and talked to an attorney and we filed for an annulment. And when he got home, he basically told me, yeah, you're not actually going to go through with that. So he didn't challenge anything, didn't, try to push anything. So I was granted my annulment and all of that. And I kind of thought, okay, well, it's done. And I was heartbroken and devastated and destroyed. And I wanted that to work. I wanted it to work so badly. And 3 months later, after our annulment was final, I get a call and it's, I've changed, I'm different, I miss you, come back and give it one more shot. And so I said, I'll give it a week, and a week turned into a month, which turned into 8 months.
So
And
you
so
remarried? Did you actually remarry?
we did not remarry. I just moved back in with him again. I wasn't walking with the Lord at this point. And, I figured, well, we'd already been married, so
Sure,
whatever.
sure. Right.
Yeah. And we had been living together before we even got married. So I like I said, I was not at all following, the Lord in that season of my life. And so, but yeah, I ended up moving back in with them. I was lying to everyone in my life about where I was. My parents didn't know where I was. But I was so convinced that I could make this work, that this could change, that this was going to happen. And things just disintegrated.
Mm, mm. So things disintegrated. When did you finally wake up to the reality that this is abuse? I know
So
that
yeah,
some people listening are going to say, how could she not know she was abused? Because you've mentioned some behaviors your ex-husband did, and they sound pretty abusive to me.
well, I think for a lot of us, we're not taught about abuse. We're taught what healthy love looks like, but we kind of gloss over, well, what do you do when it's really unhealthy? And, again, like I said, it wasn't like it started out that way. It started out fantastic. It was fun and charming. And he, like I said, I literally thought like, oh my gosh, I can't believe anyone could love me this much. And that I could ever be treated this well. And then, kind of like the lobster in the pot, the water keeps heating up. And it's like, well, that's just an isolated incident. That's just an isolated incident. They couldn't have really meant that. And I think the thing with abuse and that cycle is that the cycle is designed to keep us stuck, because we have this wonderful honeymoon phase where everything is great. It's reminiscent of those early days of our relationship. There's promises to change. Everything's awesome. And then all of a sudden we switch and the tension starts to build, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know that something's coming, something shifted. Why do I feel like I'm walking on eggshells? What's happening here? And then there's the incident. But that cycle, because it creates so much trauma in our minds, our brains literally don't have the ability to go, well, that was horrific, I probably should do something about it, because we're already on guard for the next incident. So, it's really hard for you to be able to stop in the middle of trauma and say, how do I get out of trauma? We're just designed to survive. And that's an incredible mechanism that God has given us, that survival mechanism. But at a certain point, it's extremely destructive. And so I actually didn't know that I was in an abusive. I knew something wasn't right. I would not have called it abuse. But a family member gave me a book called The Verbally Abusive Relationship. And I sat down and read it, and I literally read it through 3 times. I underlined almost the entire thing. And I still had to do like months and months of research of going, is this really abuse though? Could it be? Is there another explanation? And so it was a process for me to even be able to admit that that was what was happening in our relationship.
Mm. Wow. What did you call it?
I just thought, well, everything had an explanation, I guess is the best way to put it. Oh, well, maybe I didn't really say that. So, maybe he's right. Maybe I didn't really say that thing. Or maybe I did deserve to be called that. Or, maybe that is true. And so I think I kind of kept finding different explanations for why different things kept happening. So I didn't really see them all as connected necessarily. Or, well, he's mad, he's insecure, he's jealous, whatever the thing is. Or, I could grow, I could be better. There are things I need to work on. And so, one thing that abuse is so good at is it takes grains of truth and it twists them until they grow into these lies that they were never designed to be. So truth is here, abuse brings it over here to a complete and total lie that we begin to believe. So
Yeah,
I just didn't have that terminology.
it sounds like what you went through was really questioning, did I really see this? Did I really say that? Did I really observe this? And really questioning your own sanity or your own
Yeah.
capability of interpreting things.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, there was definitely, I don't recommend this, by the way, but there were a couple times where I actually wrote down things that I had said because I was baffled when later, the comment was, well, you never said that. We never talked about that. So I did. I actually thought I was losing my mind, and I ended up going to see a mental health professional thinking like I'm going crazy.
Yeah, I've talked to many people who say, you know, I looked back at my journals at that time because every time I feel like going back to him, or I work with men too, so every time I think about going back to her, I have to reread my journal and remind myself what actually happened. I wrote it down at the same time or contemporaneously just to make sure I wasn't going crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I did actually when I got out, that was a huge thing. A dear friend of mine, she helped me make a little book, about, the truths. Like here's what happened, here's truths about who you are. And that was huge for me in terms of not going back, because that desire to go back was still there. I mean, that love, and care for that person was still there.
Now let's go back just a little bit. So you did go back to him. You did, and
Yeah.
he asked for just a week. Then what happened?
Yeah, I mean, just like life, I mean, things were great for a week. There was no problems. It was everything I hoped it could be. That hope came back of, this time that change is real. And, lo and behold, after a couple months, it wasn't. But at that point, again, it was like, well, it's an isolated incident. Everyone makes mistakes. And it's true. Everyone does make mistakes. We're all, human. We all have things we can work on, but abuse is a pattern. And, before I knew it, that pattern was back. But I was so trapped in that, and so just the emotions and the inability to separate, what like I was just desperate for something to change what was happening.
Now, I imagine in your own mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm just projecting. Did you ever feel like, if I just fasted and prayed more, if I were more godly, if I set a better example, he would change?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely one of the big things for me was, and one of the big promises of I'm going to actually change was, well, we'll go to church,
Mm.
and so there was this desire, and I was reading faith-based books and I was doing everything. I was going to counseling. I was doing everything that I could possibly do to try to change that situation and to allow God into that situation, even though I wasn't fully surrendered to the Lord at that point.
Okay. Now, some parents would say, honey, you made your bed, now lie in it. But I know you speak so highly of your parents
Yeah.
and your dad. Every interview I see with him, he shows real empathy in these cases. What was their take on all this? And what did they do during this time of maybe cheering that you were getting an annulment? And then you go right
Yeah,
back to him.
I mean, they knew something was wrong. They didn't know how wrong it was.
Hmm.
At the time I was, when I met him, I was living in another state, going to college. So I was far away from them. There was a lot that they weren't seeing, but they knew that there was a significant change in me and it wasn't positive.
Okay.
And this, the brief amount of time that they had spent around us together, they knew something was off, but they didn't have all of the pieces. And so, my dad really describes it as in that season, they lost me. They just felt like they had totally lost me. And so when we did, when I did tell them that we had eloped, they did, hey, welcome to the family. We'll do what we can to cheer you on. But I think they knew from the beginning that that wasn't going to end well, or it was going to take a drastic miracle for that to end possibly well. And so when it came time to get the annulment, they walked with me through that process. One thing I really admire about my parents is, in the blessing, it really talks about putting your hand on someone's shoulder, and they never ever took their hand off my shoulder, but they never subsidized my behavior.
Hmm.
So it was, hey, you can do what you want, we're not paying for it. Hey, we're with you and we'll go with you to the attorney if you want, but you're paying for your annulment. So there was never any they never left and they never removed their blessing from me, but they also never like subsidized that behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does.
Um,
It
and
sure does.
and I know for them, they were doing the work too. And I work a lot, I'm sure like you do, with loved ones of people in abuse. And they were going to counseling on their own. They were processing together. And because of that, their conversations with me were able to be very different than they would have been had they not been doing that work. Because it's
Yeah.
so
So let
easy
me
as a
ask
loved
you
one.
just
Yeah.
for a second here. Some parents or some well-meaning friends would say, get out of there, get out now. He's abusing you, he's hurting you. This is abuse. You're going to end up dead on the, on the highway. I'm coming to get the van now. I'm going to pick you up and take you. What is a more helpful response? And what did your parents do?
Yeah, so that's a really great question and kind of multiple parts. So let me start with, where why that might not be the most helpful response. And let me preface this by saying that's a natural response. It makes sense. And you're allowed to feel that. In fact, you probably should feel that. But maybe, feel that inside or deal with that before you talk to your friend. But when you actually talk to someone that's in that situation, their greatest fear is that they're losing themselves or that relationship. And they really feel in so many ways like they're between a rock and a hard place. And if they've told you what's going on in that relationship, they trust you. And that's really scary and vulnerable for them for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, even just safety. For a lot of them, if that person finds out that they shared what's going on, they could actually be in physical danger or emotional danger. And so there's a lot of trust that went into them coming to you. And so really your job, you can't make somebody make any decision. Your job is to help them get help and to help them process. And so my biggest advice is help them get connected with a professional that works in domestic violence and help them begin to make, process through things with that person who's trained in it. And then you get to be a friend. And my other advice is realize that the average person, it takes 7 tries before they actually leave. And it's a journey. And there's going to be things where you're like, yes, there's movement, things, they're finally drawing boundaries. Things are, maybe they're ready to separate or to finally go do this. And then it's like a step back. And it really is sort of this cha-cha as they process their way through it. And so, your job, be a friend. And my biggest advice is connect them to someone who gets to be the guide and the professional in terms of the domestic violence piece of that. Because there's great marriage advice, but it's terrible marriage advice when there's addiction or abuse present. Yes. So that's kind of my first part of that. And then the second part is, for my parents, had they known where I was living, I think that temptation to show up and yank me out would have been a lot higher. But I think, at the end of the day, they didn't have all of the pieces. They just knew something was wrong. But they also, they realized that it had to be my choice. I was an adult who had to make the decision what I was going to do with that. And all they could do was point out truth. And I remember one time my dad, at that point, I really wasn't seeing my family because if I did, there were consequences, and it was, isolation's a really big part of abuse as well. And so, but that particular day I had to get new tires. And so my dad was like, hey, I'll buy you new tires if you meet me for coffee. And so I met my dad for coffee, and he bought me tires, and he gave me a list of 10 truths about who I was. And I remember at the time, I didn't even want to take the piece of paper, but I still carry it in my wallet today. And I started to notice,
give us some examples.
Yeah, that I was loved, that I was worthy of value, that God created me to be a leader, and that I was intelligent and smart. And, it was all these character traits about who God had created me to be, that I was a cheerleader for others and, saw people on the sidelines and brought them in. He wrote down all of these things about me. And I started to notice I'd get told one thing and I'd go in the bathroom and I'd pull out that list. And I might not have believed everything that was on it, but I wanted to. And it was a very different message than what I was hearing over here. So, they did their best to infuse truth where they could, but, they also kind of had their hands tied in terms of like, they didn't know where I was. And there were a lot of things with that where, like I just remember a couple years later when I sat, or not even a couple years, it was maybe 8 months or so, 8 or 9 months after I got out, and I was sitting with my dad having coffee again. And he just said, Kari, this is the first time you've looked me in the eye in years.
Oh,
So, I mean, I was just lost. I was just lost. So their words really were just bouncing right off at that point.
now you are so fortunate to have had really, supportive parents, because it could have
Yeah.
been, you made your bed, now lie in it. And some people's churches are that way too. Their pastors say, well, you knew he, was like this, or had this character, or he's impatient, or whatever. How has this changed your theology about the whole concept of divorce? We were brought up as conservative Christians, and for many of us, divorce is an absolute taboo, or maybe it was only for those who experienced a spouse with serial infidelity. But
Mhm.
abuse, no. I mean, you were just expected to take that because um, the theology, at least I was raised with, was that's not grounds for divorce. So
Yeah.
help me, how has your theology changed around the topic of divorce and annulment?
Yeah, so at the time, I didn't really have any theology about it because while I grew up in that environment, I wasn't walking with the Lord. And so my first concern wasn't, well, what does God think about this? But I do know that when I was ready to get out, the Lord opened the door. And he opened the door for me to get help and healing. And I got plugged into a Christian community and went through a whole series of healing and restoration in that community. And so, really, my processing on all of that came after that decision. But I think, yes, like you said, infidelity, and also, biblically, abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. And one thing that my dad kept saying again and again is, Kari, well, not only is the infidelity a huge part of this, because that was present in our relationship too, but abuse is that abandonment. And really, there's so much on this topic about how God loves marriage, absolutely, but you know what, he loves us as individuals too. And I really genuinely, in my heart of hearts, believe that verse where it says he will never leave you nor forsake you. And that means never. And you and your marriage doesn't override you as an individual, and it does not override God's ability to find grace, redemption, and healing in your story if it ends that direction. And, do I believe that marriages can be saved? Absolutely. I do marriage and family coaching and counseling. I'm a daughter of, our ministry is called Strong Families, and we help people build great relationships. But the reality is abuse is a deal breaker in so many ways. And it creates that environment where you can't be a healthy individual, you can't be healthy in your marriage, and it often really destroys our relationship with God as well. And I'm not a theologian, that's not my particular area, but there are a lot of incredible people out there that have so much content on this particular topic. I mean, anything by Leslie Vernick, she's amazing, and she does a great job. She's not a victim herself, but a counselor, and she does an incredible job of walking through all of the biblical reasons, for why and when it's actually appropriate for that to happen. And June Hunt is another one that I just love. She grew up in incredible abuse. Gosh, I want her to like adopt me and to be my like permanent grandmother. She's incredible, but she has a lot on that as well, and goes deep into the theology of why and where and when and how with abuse. And so again, that's not like, I'm not the theologian, but all of my research came after, and I have yet to find something that makes me go, that wasn't God's plan for my life. And like I said, I got out and I healed and was restored, and my life now is, I don't deserve it. I mean, none of us do, but I mean, I'm married to an incredible guy. We have an incredible little boy. I mean, God has put pieces back together and is using this story to help other people. And, again, I just want to encourage you that God's not going anywhere. And it's time, if that's really what you're stuck in and you're wrestling, it's time to start doing some research into that so that you can feel the freedom to make the decision that you need to make one way or the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love your just everything you've said, and especially that I will never leave you or forsake you. Not I will never leave you or forsake you only if you're perfect, but no matter what you do. Now, one of the messages we sometimes get, maybe it's not spoken, maybe it's just sort of inferred, but is kind of like, well, whatever problems you had in your first marriage, you're going to bring into your second marriage. So don't think that your second marriage could be any better. It's kind of there's sort of this unspoken idea about like a divorce curse. Okay.
Yeah.
So here you are. You've talked to us about how you weren't really walking with the Lord before your first marriage, not even sort of in the middle of the marriage, and even after the annulment, not quite there. So tell us, how did you meet? You've remarried your new husband, and how did you work through those kinds of doubts about, is it me?
Yeah. Yeah, so when I got out, I call it rehab, but it was really just, it was a lot of counseling, and it was, I was involved with a community that really, their whole mission is finding freedom in Christ. And so I just went all in on, because I was at this place, I was so broken where I just was like, well, it's either God or nothing, because if this doesn't work, I'm out of options. And I just don't know if I can be here anymore, and continue to live in this. And so, I went all in with the Lord, and thankfully that was the answer. And that was, the best thing that I ever could have done. And so, I met Joey about 6 or 7 years later. So, I mean, there was a lot of healing that happened in between all of that. Maybe it was a little before that, maybe it was closer to 5, but it was a while. It was a good chunk of time after I had left. And so, I think at that point, a lot of those lies of, was it me, had worked themselves out because I had done the work. And, here's the reality. And I hear this all the time, as people are processing, well, I'm not perfect in this relationship either. Well, no. And I was not perfect in my first marriage. Absolutely. I mean, there were things that I did that were wrong and were hurtful and shouldn't have done and shouldn't have said. But it doesn't change the other factors that happened. And so I had finally come to a place of healing where I was able to forgive these things and also really look at what I needed to do. And there was that divide, you know what I mean? Because I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back and change what I had done, but I could move forward in a different way with what I needed to. And so, when Joey and I met, honestly, I did still have quite a bit of fear in terms of, well, I know what it looks like when something seems really great, but is that real? And Joey, time and time again, showed me that it was. I mean, he did what he said. He meant what he said. He was gracious and forgiving to me when I didn't deserve it. I mean, even to this day, I can't think of a single time where he's yelled at me. I can't think of a single time where he's insulted me. I mean, even when we're in a fight, like, it's hilarious because I'm the one getting worked up and Joey's like, Kari, we can just talk about this, right? And he's like so kind. He's so unbelievably kind and gentle. And, and like I said, I mean, just forgiving. And so, I did have a lot of fear. And there was definitely a moment where I kind of tried to blow it all up because I was like, this can't be real. This can't possibly be real. But again, Joey's steadiness, his consistency, his love for the Lord, the way that he treated me. It was also really important to me that other people knew Joey felt like he was a good guy. And, thankfully it's kind of funny. I mean, we have so many mutual friends. It's crazy, but had never met. And every single person that I've ever talked to that knows Joey is like, Joey is a great guy. And again, you can't only look at that because a lot of people appear one way and are a different way at somewhere else. But I wasn't being told that in my first relationship. But anyways, all that to say, I mean, there was still fear, but I had done the work. And then, when Joey and I got married, it's still work. There are times I was actually talking to a girl yesterday during a coaching session, and I was telling her, she was sharing an example, and I shared one with her about Joey and I. And when we first got married, Joey would say something super casual like, "Hey, Kari, can you empty the dishwasher?" And I all of a sudden was in this spiral of, well, I've failed. I'm a terrible wife and he's going to leave. And, that just means our relationship is over. Literally all he was asking was if I could empty the dishwasher. But to me, that was like, oh no, I did something wrong. Like I can't, and so there was still stuff I had to work on. That wasn't a Joey issue. That was a me issue. And there still are, there's still, even though, I'm far past the dishwasher point, there are still things that I'm working on. So all that to say is your past doesn't dictate your future. If you do the work, if you heal, if you really are, let the Lord choose that next person for you. If, I dated and I waited. And I would have waited a lot longer to find Joey because I just was committed to the fact that I wasn't going to end up in that situation again. So
I like how it sounds like you really sort of tested him.
Yeah.
You were just a normal person. So that meant you made mistakes. That means you got angry. You probably lost your temper. We all lose our temper. And he could handle it, and he didn't freak out, and he didn't come down on you. Or someone once said, how often do you feel afraid in your marriage? And I'm thinking, never. Zero. I've never have ever felt afraid. I'm remarried also, by the way. So, it's a completely, the thing that's different is being with an abusive person or not being with an abusive person. Now, of course, as you already said, there are a lot of ways that we all need to mature. But, that we weren't the abusers, we weren't the cheaters, we weren't the, the pedophiles or fill in the blank.
Yeah, and I just think it's night and day, and it's healing. I think that's the other thing that I've really been blown away by. And, I get choked up about this all the time, is just the healing that has happened in my marriage with Joey. God has taken what was broken and continues to restore it in ways that I can't even imagine. And I'm so thankful for that. And, I remember one time when we were dating, when Joey absolutely had every right to walk away from our relationship, he washed my feet. And he just said, "Kari, I see who you are," and I mean, for him to humble himself when he could have just said, "Well, this girl's crazy," or, why are you,
baggage, or she's
I don't need to deal with this, and that's just the kind of man that he is. And his love for me and love for the Lord is just, it's healing. There's not I can't think of a better word for it. It's healing.
Now, let me ask you a little bit more about the blessing. Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that you are now a co-author on the new and updated edition of the blessing. But I want to talk to you about, what does the blessing mean to you as a daughter, having gone through divorce and remarriage? And then what does the blessing mean to a parent? I'm sure there are parents watching this who say, "Oh, I gave my son-in-law," we'll do it with a daughter and a son-in-law. I thought he was a great guy. I met him. I spent time with him. I gave him my blessing. But he turned out to be horrible. He was fooling us all. Help us understand the blessing in those circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing that if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be getting to do all of this and work with my dad, when it came to the blessing, I probably just would have laughed at you. But it's such a, for lack of a better word, blessing, getting to do this and getting to share something that's not only a part of our family, but it's transformational for other people and other families. And I think for me, what it means as a daughter is I saw it lived out in the worst of moments, and I'll never forget. I had come up to Washington from Arizona to get help and healing, and my ex didn't know where I was. And so he showed up at my parents' house and kind of demanded to know some things, and also filled them in on a lot of things that I had been lying about for a very long time. And I'll never forget when I was flying home actually to come see my family, and my dad, when I got there and he told me that that conversation had happened, he put his hand on my shoulder and he just said, "Kari, it's not about where you've been, it's about where you're going." And he gave me his blessing. And to
Wow.
me, that unleashed me. And it was, that doesn't mean that that was the only conversation that we ever had about what happened. But in that moment, his love and belief in who I was and in who God created me to be was bigger than the mistakes that I had made. And again, that doesn't excuse my behavior. I mean, there was still time in a process that happened before all of those relationships in our family, were mended. I mean, gosh, my parents were hurt, but my sister, holy moly. I mean, that one took time, and we're best friends now and it's wonderful, but I had work to do in terms of, rebuilding trust and rebuilding, there had to be some healing that happened. But in that moment, I had permission to move forward. My dad wasn't done with me. Even though all of that happened, he wasn't done. And really, the blessing has those 5 elements, appropriate, meaningful touch, that hand on someone's shoulder, that hug, that holding of the hand, but the appropriate, meaningful touch. And then there's spoken words, and those words attach high value. So, my dad's saying it's not about where you've been, it's about where you're going. This is who God has created you to be. I mean, that attaches that value. And then it helps you picture a special future, which, just basically means, God's not done with the story. It's not about where you've been, it's about where you're going. God has great plans for you. And then there's genuine commitment, which is, as long as I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not taking my hand off your shoulder. And so when my dad did that and lived that out, I felt freedom to really dive into that process of healing, and also to know that things were going to be okay with my parents and I, which was huge. And so I think, the blessing has a deep emotional meaning for me as a daughter. But, now I get to see what that does for others. And I get to see, how someone saying that to someone, whether they're in abuse or not, can be life-changing. I mean, I had a man come up to me the other day and he said, it was 25 years ago and my dad only gave me his blessing once. And I remember what he was wearing. I remember what I was wearing. And that changed the entire course of my life. And obviously, please, if you're listening to this, give your kids, give your loved ones a blessing more than once. In fact, that's kind of the purpose of this new edition, is how do you make it a lifestyle? But that one thing changed his life. And so, again, why is that? Well, because it's biblical. This is, it's a biblical way to live out love and attachment. And so, I think to me, that's kind of the significance of the blessing. And then I know you asked something else, and I got.
There are some situations where parents really do believe in the blessing, and they
Yeah, if you've blessed someone that kind of has totally, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I think the reality here is this: we all have had the wool pulled over our eyes. We all have believed somebody was someone that they weren't, whether, they were close to us or not. We've all been deceived. And, to live in shame and guilt over that, you just can't. And that doesn't mean that you're to blame. That doesn't mean that, had you brought up the red flags, things would have been, we can all go down that shoulda, woulda, coulda cycle, and it can take you there perpetually, but it doesn't change where things are today. And so I think step 1, forgive yourself. Realize we've all been there. We've all made mistakes. We've all believed, that to be true of somebody where it wasn't. And then I think now it's saying, well, what can I do to support and encourage my loved one who's maybe still in that situation? How can I give them my blessing? How can I speak these words of truth and life and attachment over them, as they're dealing with the hurt and the fallout that's happening here?
Yeah, I think from a biblical standpoint, it helps to remember the Old Testament story of King Saul, who was chosen by God to be the king. And as he became deceitful and abusive and lying and so forth, God removed his blessing from him. That's not to say that, God struck him dead instantly or anything, but he gave the blessing to the shepherd boy David instead. And, people have the ability to make their own decisions. Um, God doesn't force people to obey him or to behave rightly. He lets us make our choices, and then we end up having consequences of that. But I love how you said, your father pivoted and he continued to have the blessing for you
Yeah.
and to envision a great future for you.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, I know you have another book in the works.
Yeah.
Tell us what you're doing. Also, talk to us about your coaching. How can people contact you? And any other way we can contact you via social media? Um,
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have another book coming out. I'm really excited about this one. But before I get into that, I do want to share just one other thing. I know that there's a lot of fear around, well, can God really redeem and restore things should I choose to leave this relationship? And I just want to encourage you really quick with just a piece of my story. I mean, like I said, I eloped, and God, in my rebellion and in all of these decisions that I made, protected and set things up on the back end that I could never have imagined. And I think about this a lot where, I eloped, but I got to walk down the aisle with the man that I'm going to spend the rest of my life with for the first time. I didn't even know that that was important to me at the time. And God provided that. I mean, God provided a man that was gentle and kind and doesn't, just all of these things that God has orchestrated. And there's so many examples. I probably should write a book about it in terms of the way that God has healed and restored things. And so I just want to encourage you that if there's something that you're just afraid isn't going, like, God can't possibly heal that, he's so much bigger. He wants to heal and redeem that. That's who he is. It's in his nature. And if he did it for me, there's nothing that he cannot do for others. So before I get that, anyways, I just wanted to kind of end with that, because again, and I know that a wedding, you're probably, some people are going, well, I already got married, we had the wedding. But again, I just think God knows our heart, and he knows things that speak to us, and he knows things that those things that matter, and he's going to pursue you and show you those things as you journey. So anyways, that's my one thing. So
I just wanted to follow up with that, and I still want you to tell us all how to contact you. But one of the things that a lot of divorced women feel, and men too, is, now I'm a second-class Christian. God can never do anything with me. I'm now disqualified for ever being used by God. I have a black cloud over my head, and so do my children. I have the red D for divorce on my forehead, and I'm now cursed somehow. And what your story is telling us all is that God still has the blessing for you. Yeah. And I think that's really, really important. So tell us about your upcoming book.
I mean, just to pivot on that, I mean, there are no second-class citizens to God. He doesn't see it that way. As far as the East is from the West, and he is a God of redemption. And so if you're being told that, maybe it's time to explore some other communities. Again, and that's not to say, like you said, there are consequences of our decisions. There were things that I had to live out that were really painful, and things I had to work through that were really painful, but God wasn't done with me, and he's not done with you, or your kids, and you're not disqualified. In fact, I can't wait to hear some of the stories about what he does and how he uses that later. So but yeah, so the book I just finished, I just actually turned in the manuscript a couple of weeks ago, so it'll be coming out in the fall, I believe. It's called Remarriage, and it's all about how do you blend differences in your first couple of years of marriage. And really sort of how that came about was, Joey and I were in our 30s when we got married. So, and when we did, it was amazing to me how here I am in this relationship, and it was not big things. In my previous relationship, it was like big things, like integrity and honesty and fidelity and, mutual respect, respect at all, any of those things. But with us, it was like the dishwasher, or how do we do the budget, or how do we do this? And it just seemed like there were so many things, and we couldn't figure out how to get on the same page. And so really it's helping people kind of identify, how do we do that? And so it was a hard project in some ways, but really fun. Hard from the standpoint that writing a book, I mean, I just had a baby 5 months ago and the book was harder, just the actual writing part. So, but really fun from the standpoint of getting to interview other couples, of getting to have some really great conversations with Joey, and hopefully creating something that I hope will bless and encourage others as they go down that journey as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Now, how do they reach you?
Yeah, so you can go to karitrent.com, and it's Kari, Kari. So yeah, karitrent.com. And I do have, coaching available, social media, Kari Trent Stageberg on Instagram or Facebook are great ways. I'm not the best on social media, but I try, I'm working on it. But just send me a message. I would love to connect with you. Sign up, for coaching. I would love to connect with you. You do not need to do this alone. And whether it's me or it's somebody else, I think that's my biggest piece of encouragement is you do not need to walk this journey alone. And there are people who can help you and want to help you. And, in an abundance of counselors, there is wisdom. But again, I just caution you, pick people that are familiar with domestic violence, if that's where you're at, or addiction, if that's what you're processing through, so that the advice and the wisdom that you're getting is really something that's going to help you and help provide freedom, for you and potentially even your spouse, if they're willing to journey down that road.
Wonderful. I want to ask you this question.
Yeah.
If you could change the milieu in our churches about abuse, what would you tell pastors and church leaders to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Twofold. I think one is it's time to do some research on this topic and to really become educated on this topic, because it's happening in your church. It is, I mean, 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men. I think those numbers are a lot higher even now with the pandemic. And so it is happening in your church, and you need to be aware of the red flags. You need to be aware of what's going on. And also, it's time to start talking about it. This doesn't need to be a taboo topic. I think there's a lot of fear of, well, if I bring this up, then that means everyone's getting divorced. And that's not the case. The reality is bringing this up gives people the option for it to be healed, and it gives people a choice. And we need men to be having this conversation with other men, because I can't hold a man accountable. I can't change, I can't speak into that the same way that another man can, just realistically. And especially an abusive man is not going to hear what I have to say. And so we need men to be stepping into that space and to be willing to have those conversations and to be educated about this topic of abuse. What does the Bible really say about it? Dig in, do your homework, read, research. And my other advice would just be have a network of professionals that you can refer to, because this is going to show up in your office. And I'm telling you, if you do not have someone that is specializing in domestic violence, you could be giving great advice that's actually really damaging for both people in that situation. And I think so often we think, oh, well, it's only the victim, that's being damaged. And that's true. But if you think about it, this other person's living in a cycle of sin and destruction. That's not great for them either. So,
Right.
I know the heart of pastors is to help people find freedom. Refer to someone who does that professionally. Do not be afraid to bring in help. And so I think that's my biggest advice on that.
Yeah. I mean, domestic violence, educators, awareness advocates, counselors, they are listening for certain things that the average counselor is not trained to listen for.
Yeah.
And so they're looking for those patterns where a person's dignity is being stripped away. They are being treated with, indifference, contempt, different things that maybe don't rise in somebody's mind as being to the level of being abuse, but are part of abuse.
Yes.
And it's just so important to have someone who's really well trained. Otherwise, they accidentally end up siding with the abuser and making it even worse for the victim. So I really love your advice to get your pastors, be sure to get your resources um, at your fingertips. Get that domestic violence shelter, get a domestic violence awareness, a trained therapist, because this is not a place where you can just tell that godly husband or wife, just, stay and pray and be patient and try to, give up a positive attitude and they'll change. Sometimes it's a matter of life and death, and they aren't even telling you because people won't tell you about anything that rises to the level of felony. I've been doing divorce recovery in conservative churches for over 20 years. And I always find that usually, actually, I shouldn't say that I always find, but often I won't hear about the felony level abuse until I've known them 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
I won't hear about, the weapons and the battering or the pedophilia or anything like that, anything that rises to criminal level until they have really gotten to know me and really have gotten to trust me. So I think pastors need to assume that whatever's going on is actually far worse than what's being reported, than thinking that that person is exaggerating.
Absolutely. And again, that's where the more you know, the more you know. And so, again, there's a lot of great resources, and there, some are biblical and some, are secular resources. They're all great. But I think, again, Leslie Vernick has great resources. June Hunt has great resources if you're looking for biblical. Lundy Bancroft has a great book, Why Does He Do That? And I think just the more you know, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the other thing to know, I think, as a pastor is that for the victim, one, if the abuser is sitting next to them, they're not going to tell you the fullness of what's happening, period. Second, a lot of times they might not even consider it to be what it is, and I hear this all the time. Oh, well, he didn't hit me, but he just pinned me down. So it's not physical abuse. Oh, he didn't hit me, but he kept me from leaving the room. Oh, he didn't hit me, but he threatened to physically harm me or my kids or the dog. I hear this all the time. Well, he didn't hit me, but he pinned me down. So it's not physical abuse. Or he didn't hit me, but he kept me from leaving the room. Or he didn't hit me, but he threatened to hurt me or the kids or the dogs. Well, all of that is physical abuse. And you said this earlier. I mean, you literally could be saving someone's life. And my other thing is if there are kids involved, if there are people under the age of 18 and you hear anything that is triggering, hey, you know what, this might not be a safe situation, as a pastor, you are a mandated reporter. So depending on the state you live in, but I think just you should be. So you need to take action to report that. Don't tell the people that you're doing that. That gives them time to hide and cover up things. But you could actually even be liable if something happens in that situation and you didn't take action on that.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, do your, just do your homework and be aware. I mean, loving people well is understanding what they're going through. And I think this is a big issue that the church, hasn't dove into, and it's happening. It's prevalent and it's happening, and it's time for us to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, calling Child Protective Services doesn't mean that person's going to get arrested tomorrow or tonight. They're going to do a full investigation. Maybe they find something, maybe they don't, but you did your job. And I think that's really important. Let me ask you a question about pro-marriage Christian organizations. And I've mentioned to you before that I'm really snarky toward Focus on the Family because they have not added abuse as to their list of valid reasons for divorce. But what do you wish that pro-marriage Christian organizations would say and do about abuse?
I think kind of similar to the church, where I think the more that people realize that abuse is something within a marriage that is cause for it to end, without having to have all these additional qualifiers because of what it does to the individual, because of what it does spiritually, because of what it, even just the biblical lines that it follows. I think, again, there's growth and movement in a lot of organizations where they're finally talking about this because they're realizing how prevalent it is. And so I think my hope is that there's more of that, that there's more education around that, and that when people call and receive help, that there's support in the way that it needs to be. And I can't speak for Focus. I don't work for Focus. But I do know, I have talked extensively with their counseling team and with a lot of people there. And I mean, safety is incredibly important, physical, emotional safety. And so I do think that as a whole, evangelical Christianity needs to not be afraid of what happens when abuse is brought to light. What they need to do is trust that God is bigger than that, and God has a redemptive story available to both individuals if they choose that. And if someone does not choose that, that does not prevent redemption over here. And again, I'm not saying that that's what they believe. I don't think they would have shared my story had they believed that. But I do think, as I'm watching them, Focus and some other organizations have finally kind of step into this space in a new way. I think my prayer is just that they would really step into it, really continue to go down that road of how can we help others who are really in this spot.
Well, you brought up something when we talked last week, and that is that your story, telling your testimony on Focus on the Family's broadcast, was the first time, or maybe the first time in a long time, they had ever done that. And they just got overwhelmed with an amazing positive response that they were addressing this and talking about it so openly. And I think that's a really good sign.
Yeah. And I love Focus. I think, just like any person or any individual, there's always, we're not always going to, be on the same page about how we would do everything. But I mean, like I said, I'm so honored and blessed that they did decide to share my story. And I know the people there, and I know that their heart, and it's not to harm others. It's not to perpetuate abuse. It's to help people build healthy relationships and God honoring relationships, and abuse is not a piece of that. So again, I'm not a Focus spokesperson. I can't speak for Focus, but
no, that's okay. I just always have to ask because I've been so snarky to them and holding their feet to the fire on this issue. But I'm very glad that they took that step and have interviewed you. And Darby Strickland's done a great job on the topic of abuse. I mean, there have been, and of course, Leslie Vernick, of course, she's kind of been the forerunner of all of us.
Yep.
Her landmark book in 2010. So anyway, well, thank you so much for your time, Kari. I hope people reach out to you at least to say hi and to say that they heard this interview. And I just pray God's blessing on you, that you will be a huge blessing to others.
Thank you.
If you benefited from this recording, you will find support and clarity in my book, The Life-Saving Divorce, available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon and in 2022 as an audiobook. You can also follow me, Gretchen Baskerville, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. You can sign up for my email list at lifesavingdivorce.com. Women and men of faith may request to join my private Facebook group, Life-Saving Divorce. For more on life-saving divorces, please subscribe and click the link to the next recording.